Hello, Marcy and or TA. This is our presentation. It's on natural selection. It is me, it's Audrey Wright, Kaylin Osborne, and William King, who we will all be presenting.
Okay, I'm going to be talking about natural selection, which is kind of the general definition of everything that we're talking about in this presentation. And it's basically the process where traits that are better suited for the environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. So those traits become more common over time in a population throughout generations. An example of this is the finches that Darwin observed, and on the island there was a variety of finches at the beginning that had different beak sizes, and different beak sizes allowed them to have advantages when it came to finding food. The thick beaks were better for cracking open hard seeds and nuts, whereas the thin ones were meant for more reaching to flowers or finding insects. And since the island only had hard seeds, the ones with the bigger beaks were more successful in finding food, and so they survived better, which meant that their offspring would carry those genes from their parents of the thicker beaks, and then over time the population became all thick-beaked finches.
I'll be presenting on aspects of natural selection. The first one is going to be variation. So there are variations in species that allow for natural selection to work. And these variations are either produced by just the crossover of genetics when gametes interact and form an eventual zygote, or during regular mutations that can happen while the specimen is alive. So an example of this would be the Polynesian cricket right here. So this little guy lives on the island of Maui. And before an invasive fly species came, the crickets would attract mates by rubbing their legs together to create a sound that would attract females. But as soon as that invasive species came, it would eat the crickets that would make that sound. So a chance mutation in one of these crickets meant that one cricket who was a male did not, when he attracted mates, he did not rub his legs together, so he did not create a sound, and he attracted a female, but he didn't get eaten. And so because he didn't get eaten, he passed those genetic traits down to his offspring, which allowed the inheritable trait of rubbing your legs together and not making a sound to get passed down. And without things like crossover of genetics that happens during a zygote formation, or just regular mutations that happen when an organism is alive, species would not be able to evolve.
The second aspect of natural selection is inheritance. These traits have to be inheritable. It doesn't really mean anything if an organism learns it in its lifetime but is not able to pass it down, because it doesn't really mean it's great for that individual, but it doesn't really mean anything for that species. An example of this is the webbed feet in ducks, where this trait has adapted to their species, and new ducks that are born or hatched, they will gain webbed feet, if not straight from the egg. They'll gain it in their lifetime. It is genetic, not necessarily something that they learn or control. And an example against that, or an example of non-inherited traits, is the muscles gained by Dirk. Here, Dirk, in his lifetime, he has gained these magnificent arms, but it's not something that will be passed down to his kids. When he reproduces, his kids will come out with scrawny-looking bones. And that inheritance only works with traits that are inheritable or genetic, something that can be passed down, like the webbed feet.
So this is an aspect of natural selection. It's differential survival and reproduction. Differences in survival and reproduction is due to the differences in the phenotype, and the phenotype is basically the appearance of the creature. It's the traits that can be observed, not the genotype. An example of this could be the mice that we learned about that survived better in the environment that blended with their fur. So mice with the black fur survived better because they were able to stay safe from predators because they matched the environment better than like a white mouse. Or for example, these giraffes, the trees are higher, so the giraffes with the longer necks are going to be able to reach the trees better than the ones with the shorter necks.
So the fourth aspect of natural selection is adaptation. Adaptation is defined as any alteration in the structure or function of an organism or any of its parts that results from natural selection and by which the organism becomes better fitted to survive and multiply in its environment. Essentially what this means is it kind of plays into all the other aspects of natural selection, but adaptation is the process by which an organism retains more beneficial structures and beneficial changes. So over time, through variation and through survival of the fittest, creatures will retain beneficial structures. So in some animals, it's a strong venom that allows them to kill prey faster. In some animals, it's just stronger legs, they can run faster. In some animals, it's a higher reproductive rate, so they'll have more offspring, which will survive more. It's just any trait that is beneficial to an organism's survival or fitness becoming common and propagating over time. A great example of this is with humans. Over time, as we deviated from our common ancestors with apes, we stood further upright and our leg and arm proportions became more similar, which allowed us to run long distances and to use tools and to actually throw things better, which increased our survival rates and our hunting ability. A different example is in the Pacific Northwest, newts and garter snakes. And this is an example of an evolutionary arms race where two species adapt against each other and their adaptations are beneficial in this very specific circumstance, but don't really help them against a lot of other species out there. So this newt developed a toxin to ward off predators, which was good, but then this garter snake developed a defense against that toxin so it could eat the newts. And because of that, they kept adapting stronger toxins and stronger defenses to a point where it wasn't really necessary for any of the other animals nearby, but it helped them against each other, and so they keep adapting further and further out.
With maximum survival reproduction, it is not just about being the fittest or just being able to survive or just being able to reproduce, but instead it is being able to survive and reproduce long enough to do that. And so it's not just about being strong or not being about the best specimen in your species, but instead it is about survival and reproducing. A good anti-example of that is the mule, which has a parent of a horse and a donkey, and it has the best traits from both, and even better. It's able to carry longer loads or bigger loads in proportion to its body weight, and is not as stubborn as a donkey, but it's not able to reproduce, therefore it is a not fit organism.
So our next few slides are going to be about evidence for natural selection. The evidence is so important for natural selection, just like it is for every other scientific field, because it's through the evidence that we can test our hypotheses and show where our knowledge comes from. It's the evidence that supports the growth of our knowledge and our reasoning, and it allows future scientists to test what we've learned and claimed. The evidence for natural selection goes all the way back to when Darwin initially wrote on the origin of the species, and he first introduced the ideas of evolution by natural selection and adaptation and everything else. In his writings, he provided some evidence by citing comparative biology and the geographic, separation, famously of the finches and some other species in the Galapagos archipelago in South America. Nowadays, we have many more kinds of evidence and many more things that we've learned about natural selection because of it, but it was so important that Darwin was not silent about what he first learned and was willing to share his evidence and his knowledge with the world so that we can continue to increase the scientific field and to increase our understanding.
So evidence of natural selection, the first piece of evidence that we have is artificial selection. So we as humans have selected desirable features in organisms, and we've continued to breed the organisms with favorable traits so that we can have their offspring, with those exact same traits. So an example of this would be dogs or apples or racehorses. For example, with dogs, cuteness, fluffiness, how calm they are, how easy they are to play with are traits that humans have favored over time. And so we've kept breeding dogs that have those favorable trait features. And with apples, there's a bunch of different kinds of apples, like Honeycrisp or Gala, and we breed the apples depending on what kind of trait we're seeking for. And then with racehorses, we want the fastest horses to win the Kentucky Derby. So Whatever horse wins the Kentucky Derby one year is bred with a lot of different horses to make sure that its offspring will then be able to hopefully win the Kentucky Derby the next year.
The second evidence of natural selection is comparative anatomy, where organisms that have similar anatomy to each other show evidence of a common ancestor and therefore natural selection. An example of this is homologous structures, where each of these have similar bone structures, yet they very clearly have different purposes in a wing and a flipper and a hoof. Another example of this is the vestigial structures, where some organisms continue to maintain structures that they no longer use, and it makes no sense for them to have it unless there's a common ancestor that is left over. An example of that is the whale with pelvic bones, where we as humans use them, and whales have them, but they don't use them, and so it's evidence of that common ancestor.
Okay, and then another is embryonic natural selection. So this is like the idea that we all connect to one common ancestor, which is not shown with like a mature body of an organism, but you can see that with the embryos, they all look pretty similar, even though there's fish, chicken, pigs, and humans. And so you can see that the structure of the embryos is all very similar because we have that shared ancestor. But as it develops through time of the development of the embryo, you can see that at the beginning there's tails and kind of like slits for gills, and as it goes on, the human here, the tailbone gets smaller, where the fish has its tail. And yeah, so embryos often will retain the leftover traits from a common ancestor, which is why we still have a tailbone, but we don't have a tail like a fish.
Okay, so another example or another piece of evidence of natural selection is geographical evidence. So geographical evidence shows natural selection because organisms evolve differently when they're isolated in different environments. An example of an isolation of a population would be marsupials in Australia. So those would be things like kangaroos or koalas or wombats. They have unique features that are very specific to marsupials. One of them is giving birth to their young, and then their young climb into their little pouch and stay there until they are fully grown and able to live outside of their mother's pouch. Because Australia has unique conditions, like it's very dry and it has very different plant life than other continents, marsupials evolve differently than mammals on other continents and have unique features because of it.